for the book Tip of the Spear, Black Radicalism, Prison Repression, and the Long Attica Revolt. This is just to make the book more accessible so those who want to listen to it like an audiobook, the space is recorded. I'm going to put the PDF in this space as well as link a couple of crowdfunds. So you're going to hear some silence on the recording while I get that up. So I'm putting crowdfund posts in the replies of the space so that people can also help to fund mutual aids and crowdfund requests. So I have that link. I'm going to go ahead and get started on the reading. So again, this is Tip of the Spear, Black Radicalism, Prison, Repression, and the Long Attica Revolt. Scroll this couple of pages. I'm going to skip the introduction and just start off from page 23. And actually, I encourage people to go and read the introduction. The whole book is amazing, but just so the recordings won't be too long, I'm just going to just skip that. But it is good to go back and read it. Damn, it's mad long too. All right, boom. Part 1, the Long Attica Revolt. All right, Chapter 1, Sharpening the Spear, Strategies and Tactics of Revolutionary Action. During the late afternoon of October 2nd, 1970, 6 incarcerated men marched across the interior courtyard of the Long Island City branch of the Queens House of Detention, known commonly as Branch Queens, and approached a cluster of microphones perched atop 2 folding tables. In front of them stood a phalanx of print, radio, and television journalists, police officers, departments of correction, guards, elected officials, and community leaders, as well as DOC Commissioner George F. McCarthy. Behind them, anonymous faces were visible through broken but still barred windows. What could not be seen were the 6 DOC guards who had been taken hostage and sequestered somewhere in the jail's interior. The jail's entire captive population, 335 human beings, had exploded in rebellion the previous day. Over the next several hours, captives in 4 more New York City jails would rebel, and in ensuing months, an anti-carceral revolt would traverse the Empire State. Recorded by CBS TV, the public statements of Victor Martinez, an elected rebel spokesman, demystify the political stakes of this unfolding struggle. Martinez, a member of the Young Lords Party, situated this militant collective action within the long array of resistance to racial colonial violence. Grab some water. This system has oppressed us for the last 400 years, and we're here to put a stop to it, he proclaimed, his voice quivering with rage. Martinez's analysis contradicted that of DOC officials who preferred to frame the quote-unquote disorder as a reaction to jail conditions, especially overcrowding. While the brutal density of the environment, the fact that human beings were packed 2, 3, and sometimes 4 to a cage designed for one, no doubt stoked their discontent. Martinez and others understood themselves to be engaged in a struggle that exceeded the spatial boundaries of a given institution and the temporal confines of the historical present. They conceptualized their captivity as only the latest iteration of a regime that had ensnared colonized people for centuries by relocating the rebellion's historical point of origin from jail conditions to the violence at the core of Western modernity. Martinez constructed the rebels as legitimate political actors, indeed, as anti-colonial revolutionaries who had taken bold and necessary steps to halt a transgenerational onslaught. So I love this part and how the author words this because it's really important. I was just talking to a comrade who I have his post in the Jumbotron. His name is Kasim Garo. And me and him talk often. He's been held hostage by the state for over 20 years. He's been in and out of prison since 16, but well, I think it was since 14. And then at 16 is when he got put away. He just recently got transferred to another prison in Maryland. But me and him were talking about like the sanitation of prison abolition over the years, how we started with, not started, but how prison abolition was about breaking free political prisoners and how are we going to destroy the prison, doxing, what we call doxing today, but back then they would go and find people who were like guards in prison and take them out. For every police killing, there was a reaction by killing the police. Like that was the type of response. But over time, if we look at where we are currently, these movements or these, I would even say like the way they present these movements is so watered down to where prison abolition has now become just writing letters, just letting the state sustain and expand, but just like us use what little resources we have through being exploited by the capitalist system to try to, give like books and band-aids is basically what I'm saying. And then when they revolt, we often frame it in that same watered down context to where we'll say like, oh, they're mad because it's overcrowded. If the conditions were just better in prison, how absurd does that sound? But it's how they present it to us now. They say if their conditions were just better in prison, then they wouldn't be revolting. And they themselves have written, and I'm glad it's written this way, that no, that's not why they revolt. And talking with Kasim, same thing. He doesn't talk about, organizing the new Africans behind bars because they want better conditions. They understand that it's a strategy and it's always connected to the colonial structure that they are living on a plantation, that they are slaves. So when we take away that radicalism out of these we currently have a few prison strikes going on, actually. We have the Alabama, which is off and on, but still ongoing. And then you have some here in Texas. But when we take away that radical aspect, we water it down and we end up approaching it from a very liberal standpoint, but then again, it's not radical because it does nothing to get rid of the conditions. I just really love how he put it in that way. I'll keep reading. Let's see. In what follows, I trace the rise and fall of the New York City jail rebellion, the opening chapter of the Long Attica Revolt. I explore how figures like Martinez and many others, the revolt's organic intellectuals, elected spokesmen, and hidden engineers, labored to steer the collective rage of the wretched in the revolutionary direction. I analyze their public-facing demands while ultimately looking beyond them, toward the internal dynamics of their insurgent organization, processes of self-governance, and anti-carceral strategy. I also explore how the rebels and the state negotiated the role of violence in achieving those objectives. As I have already argued, tip of the spear is a military idiom for that which creates a breach in the enemy's defenses, forced behind enemy lines, behind walls erected to preserve the existing social order. Incarcerated people possess a latent insurgent potential, detailing a process I call sharpening the spear. This chapter shows how jail captives began to pull themselves together, honing their capacity to act as a unit, preparing themselves to strategically engage in a war that had surrounded them and saturated their very being. Making their tactical victories legible, I show how this besieged population managed to exert political leverage from within one of the most repressive institutions in U.S. society, succeeded in radicalizing populations on both sides of the walls, and inaugurated a paradigm of revolutionary struggle that intensified over time. Grab some water. So yeah, real quick. So again, I have my comrade posted in the space. I think it's the second bullet. That's Qasim Jarreau, a new African, Pan-Africanist and a communist, and has been held behind enemy lines for over 20 years. And while held captive, he has been educating people, educating new Africans and revolutionizing them. And always in Black August, the CEOs put him in solitary because of that. So what me and him plan to do is create a newsletter so that people can understand what is going on behind bars, so that we can also understand that, one, we have comrades we left behind and forgotten about, and not just their enslavement by the capitalist system, but how they are themselves fighting a classist system within the prison structure, but also organizing within that system and all of its politics therein. And it is some of the most amazing revolutionary work written that goes unnoticed. So the newsletter is going to be able to get their writings accessible to the people out here, as well as us be able to send correspondence to them and let them know what's happening out here. So I'll be posting that. I already got his permission. And yeah, I think I'm really glad I'm reading this book with y'all. So this next section is Dispatches from the Tombs. The August 11th, 1970 edition of the New York Times featured a list of demands authored in the Manhattan House of Detention, an infamous jail properly known as the Tombs. The carefully worded statement assailed the city courts for allowing legions of the poor to languish in decrepit cages for months without trial and for ignoring their writs and their petitions seeking legal redress. It accused the Legal Aid Society, a nonprofit organization charged with defending them, of encouraging the accused to accept plea deals that railroaded them to prison. That is so fucking important. It's because when we talk about nonprofits and the nonprofit industrial complex, we have to understand that how those also act as counterinsurgencies when we are in a state of resistance and rebellion, and act as wet blankets to, stifle people's rightful, wants to revolt. So I'm so glad he mentioned that, because here's where we see how a nonprofit was also used to aid the state in the imprisonment of new Africans, of Black people. So I'll keep reading. This shit gonna hit. I'm just warning y'all. Y'all gonna love this book. Hopefully I'm giving it justice reading it. The authors framed the judiciary as a rationalized instrument of violence from which we cannot receive any justice and can only suffer threat, coercion, and intimidation disguised as law and order. This dispatch denounced jail conditions, moldy food, lack of clothing, restricted access to law books, overcrowding, infestation of lice, roaches, mice, and rats. They accused their keepers of subjecting them, and especially the Blacks and Puerto Ricans, to incessant physical violence. It was common practice, they wrote, for guards to beat defenseless inmates into unconsciousness, often injuring them for life, physically and mentally, or both. Demanding the immediate cessation of this system of brutality and dehumanization and justice, they signed the document. We are one people. As we will see again and again, this statement is the core aspiration of the Long Attica Revolt. Though authored in a specific institution, this document was relevant across the jail system, a network of institutions distributed across 4 city boroughs and Rikers Island. Written for a general audience, it was a measured critique of what was seen in radical circles as a concentration camp system that aimed to dehumanize and liquidate the radicalized poor. And I want us to start embracing that idea of that is exactly what the prison industrial complex is. Because what happens is that through indoctrination and, of course, propaganda and all other forms of just coercion to co-sign allowing the continuation of a prison industrial complex to exist, they oftentimes tie it to crime. So that these systems of slavery exist for our own protection, that we're protecting you from yourselves because there's too much crime and you are just killing each other anyways. And what happens is you end up getting a people, an oppressed people, some who are class aspirationists, meaning they want to climb the ladder. So to divide themselves from the criminal, quote unquote, element, they co-sign the expansion of the prison industrial complex and all other things, right? So what I'm trying to say is that when we embrace and understand that we live in a white settler colonial state and the prison industrial complex is just a network of concentration camps, that those who resist, even if they do commit a crime, let's say if they loot or if they steal, there is no justice in a white settler colonial state. Like we live in a capitalist system that exploits us until we fucking die. We have every right to take wherever the fuck we want. And when we have that mindset of being unruly, we understand why we have to be about totally abolishing prisons, because they are only there to contain that revolutionary spirit and that radicalism among us so that they can keep us repressed. So I'm gonna keep reading. I'll read that part over too, just in case. Written for a general audience, it was a measured critique of what was seen in radical circles as a concentration camp system that aimed to dehumanize and liquidate the radicalized poor. And I want to say that again, these are those involved in the Attica uprising. The inmates themselves are telling you this is what this revolt is for. We need to connect to our people who are behind enemy lines, AKA the prison system, because I'm telling y'all, there is so many revolutionary things happening that we are missing because we're disconnected from them. I'll keep reading. In the wake of the rebellion, a jail official who was far from a radical declared, if we kept our animals in the Central Park Zoo in the way we cage fellow human beings in the tombs, a citizens committee would be organized and prominent community leaders would be protesting the inhumanity of our society. So basically this guard, again, who's not radical at all, says that, yo, if we treated animals the way we treat human beings in prisons, there would be a committee formed immediately to rectify and change those conditions. That's how bad they treat it. Now, again, he's not radical and sees that. So imagine how much worse it actually is. And again, we go every day allowing it to stand and to continue and to expand. Sick. And when we see how depraved this is, and when you start thinking about how depraved this all is, you get angry when you get a politician or a person in a church or a conservative or a reactionary justifying the presence of police. You'll start seeing that person as you should see them, counter-revolutionary. And then you'll see a pig and you'll understand why. They're an occupying force. And they in no way serve protection, but nothing else but the state and empire. And you would get even angrier when they kill one of us. But let me continue. Discourses of criminal justice legitimized this race and class war. Between 1967 and 1970, the jail population nearly doubled. A system built for fewer than 8,000 people now confined more than 14,000. Although a moral panic about rising crime suggested otherwise, misdemeanor and discretionary arrests drove this growth. Moreover, the majority of the city's captives were pre-trial detainees, in quotes, meaning the majority of the people who were captured, they were in for a crime that they committed. They were in pre-trial, so they hadn't been, found guilty or innocent. meaning they had not been convicted of, oh, I should just kept reading. Sorry, meaning they had not been convicted of the crimes of which they were accused. Rather, they were in jail because they were either denied bail or, as was more often the case, could not afford to pay the bail set by the judge. So also too, and I encourage y'all to look up the way that there's policy being pushed for, in some states they have approved it, where they don't have to offer you bail anymore, regardless of the severity of the crime. And isn't that interesting that more and more people or states are adopting this policy when more and more people are becoming discontent and more direct actions are happening, more protests? The official purpose of bail is to ensure that the accused appear at trial, while also protecting their civil liberties before the trial takes place. However, as historian Toussaint Louverture has argued, this moment was increasingly characterized by the political use of bail as a strategy of preventative detention, a means of incapacitating economically surplus and politically restrictive populations. Bail enabled judges to remove people from circulation and preempt certain behaviors deemed threatening. A clear attack on the poor. It was common for pretrial detainees to languish behind bars for 6, 12, or 18 months on bail amounts as low as $100. Those lucky enough to reach their scheduled hearing date were handcuffed and marched from the jail to a courthouse, where they were crammed into court detention pens, another set of dark, hot, filthy cages, and forced to wait for several hours to be called for arraignment. And even then, their proceedings could be delayed, forcing their return to the jail. One captive likened it to being suspended in reality for an indefinite period of time. I just have to say, as we read the conditions of our people being held captive by the state in the prison industrial complex and the network of concentration camps, I hope it pisses people off, because the way in which they have desensitized us to it, that we can walk past it. Whole cities are literally maintained by the enslavement of these people because of corporations using them, like Levi Jeans, Microsoft, and so on and so forth. This is so sick. And if you ask yourself, which I often do, like, damn, yo, if I was born in like 1800 and something, what would I be doing? And a lot of us, when we look around and see the way people are reacting now in these conditions, justifying it, telling us that it's not that bad, and, you know, things are actually getting better while these conditions still exist. And like I said, expand. Let me get reading, because I can keep rambling on, y'all. This shit be pissing me the fuck off. I'm saying it's time for revolution, basically. It's been time. Amid conditions of extreme duress, the dregs of the capitalist order begin to fashion themselves anew. Out of the necessity of survival, they organized political formations that built on their diverse experiences in street gangs, crime syndicates, the US military, and groups like the BPP and the YLP. Through radical study, deliberation, and debate, a process often described as iron sharpening iron, they begin to forge solidarity across various lines of difference and collectively analyze the deep structures that produce their incarceration within these hellish human zoos. By 1970, a new spirit had emerged within the jail. So basically what happened is, during this time frame of 1967 and 1970, the police, of course, were arresting and kidnapping as many radicals as possible, because during that time frame, they don't frame it like that often. But if you read books like Black Awakening in Capitalist America, they quote many police and politicians and members of the business class at that time as describing that time period as an act of ongoing guerrilla warfare. That there was ongoing guerrilla warfare. Like, the police would say, yo, we can't even enter these places because I feel like I'm in combat, because that's what it was. So anyways, I say that to say that, so the state, of course, was kidnapping these people to try to quell that ongoing guerrilla warfare and that revolutionary process by any means necessary. But what these radicals were doing, once captive by the state, they were organizing within prisons, educating. The same thing that they were doing on the outside, they continued the revolutionary struggle on the inside. And that is why we need to connect to the people that are held captive by the state today, is because that same revolutionary process is ongoing. The other times I was in, right here. By 1970, a new spirit had emerged within jail. As one of the rebellion survivors later told the press, the other times I was in, prisoners were sort of conditioned to accept brutality. There was a feeling that if you said something or complained, you were a punk. It's different now. People were not giving in. Among the many who nurtured this new spirit, who helped sharpen the spirit and fuse the population into one people, was a ghostly figure named Caspar Baker Gary. We will take a closer look at Caspar in Chapter 4. But for now, let us note that he was radicalized through his incarceration in Clinton and Attica during the 1960s. Prisoncrats labeled him a Muslim, a Panther, a Black militant agitator, and political activist. He was a nonconformist, a practitioner of what I call mad science, whose ethical philosophy, political ideology, and system of knowledge did not cleave to established paradigms of thought. In November of 1969, while languishing in the tombs on a parole violation, Caspar authored the Prisoners, Injustice, Resistance, and Survival Manual, a secret document that aimed to foster a spirit of unity and solidarity based on the reality of a common oppression. I'll make that into a post with the link to a free PDF so that everyone can have access to it. It's called Prisoners, Injustice, Resistance, and Survival Manual. The manual delineates an ambitious vision for the development of a new organization called the Prisoners' Liberation Front, PLF. Caspar imagined the PLF as a disciplined formation capable of coordinating political activities among people held captive across city jails and state prisons, as well as hospitals, where rebellions were also emerging, and all other institutions in which any person is made to unwillingly remain. That was another thing too, is that during the time of guerrilla warfare, of ongoing resistance against the white settler colonial state by the Black Liberation Army, by the Black Panthers and other resistance groups, they weren't only being taken to jails and prisons, they were also taken to mental institutions. And even there, they were organizing and radicalizing people. But that's just to remind that the state has many ways in which they target a people they aim to keep repressed and oppressed. As per the manual, each carceral site would develop its own PLF chapter. Each chapter would be divided into branches, which in turn would be further subdivided into sections. I started stuttering there because I just remembered too, in naming that the state has many ways in which they will capture people who want to resist. It's also important to understand that's why you have to have a developed politic around disability justice, around dismantling ableism, around confronting ableism by any means necessary. And this is why we have to have a well-rounded, well-developed politic by putting the most marginalized in the center. It affects every aspect of this network system of white supremacy. I'll continue. As per the manual, each carceral site would develop its own PLF chapter. Each chapter would be divided into branches, which in turn would be further subdivided into sections. Sections were to consist of 2 or more prisoners residing in the same side, tier, or dorm. It shall be named after the institution in which it functions, as for instance, Tombs Prisoners Liberation Front, 8th floor, Seaside section. The organization would be administered by officers tasked with clearly defined roles pertaining to political education, intelligence gathering, communications, propaganda, healthcare, finance, and security. Caspar laid out the expectations of each role with meticulous attention to detail. For example, the information officer was expected to keep in secret codes essential records for the section and for transmission elsewhere. Will be responsible for obtaining of new items, articles, and essays for publication in the newspaper. Will also concern himself with obtaining and circulating revolutionary literature. Get a drink of water. And that's another thing that me and Kasim do is I send him books. Now, a lot of the prisons are cracking down even more on certain literature they're allowed to get. Of course, I'm sending him like radical literature, but at the time he was allowed to get it. Again, they're starting to repress more and more the people within the prison system, especially those who are politically active, which is why we need to be reaching out and doing what we need to do to confront this, because they're also a part of the revolutionary struggle. The development of autonomous captivities for acquiring, preserving, the development of autonomous capacities for acquiring, preserving, and transmitting knowledge are indispensable to the conduct of revolutionary warfare. And as I will show in the second part of this book, these capacities were seen as especially threatening to the state. PLF membership was to be extended to those who took on an oath, swearing to support the ideas contained in the manual. This is highly significant, as oath-taking has been a core feature of insurgent movements across a range of contexts. Oaths figure prominently in the conduct of Maroon resistance of the 17th century, the French Revolution of the 18th century, and the so-called Mau Mau emergency of the 20th century, and in the far-right oath keepers movement of our contemporary movement. Oaths signify the consecration of an individual's loyalty to a collective and their active withdrawal of support from opposing forces. To me, that's so important as like a principle, because what it says to me, or how I interpret it, is like, it's not enough for someone to say, oh, I'm anti-racism. I need to know what the fuck you're doing to these crackers to destroy it. What part of the struggle are you engaging in? And I think we need to raise the bar on not only ourselves, but each other in that way. That it's not enough to just say like, oh, I'm not doing that, or I'm not that person, because honestly, it's a lie. I mean, we can pick any oppressed group. We could say, as people who are able-bodied, oh, I'm not ableist. You know, I consider all, disabled people. And that's not true, because in the system we exist under, as an able-bodied person, as all people indoctrinated in the system, actually, we are all inherently ableist. It's conditioned into us. Living under a system of white supremacy, we are automatically anti-Black. Even as Black people, we are anti-Black. It is conditioned in us each and every day. So it's not enough to say I'm pro-Black. It's not enough to say pro-Black thing. It's not enough to have the performance of it all, right? It's engaging in revolutionary struggle, because the objective is to be free, not comfortable in our oppression. So I love that line as a principle. By introducing this oath-taking process into the prison, Casper sought to force captives to formally declare which side of the war they were on, and to constantly demonstrate that commitment. PLF members were enjoined to always greet each other with the clenched fist salute, while declaring all power to the people. Casper was transferred to the state prison system before the Tombs erupted in rebellion, but not before his ideas left their mark on the population. Not only would PLF chapters later emerge throughout the state prison system, but 6 months later, Victor Martinez helped organize a similar name organization that performed many of the functions set forth in Casper's manual. As Martinez told the Black Panther, the Inmates Liberation Front began as a committee of 2 people, which grew to 4, and then kept multiplying until we were able to organize the complete 9th floor. Again, so important for us to hear that, because oftentimes you see a lot of the people move in ways where they're like more concerned with numbers, quantity, rather than quality. And we see this with organizations. And because I'm a communist, I'm going to name, how it exists within my circles, right? Or within the circles of people who proclaim to be communists and socialists. They'll have these organizations where they're more so concerned about having mass amount of people within this organization that they'll excuse predators, that they'll excuse grifters, that they'll turn the eye at contradictions that, put the people at harm's way just to maintain numbers. But when you start off with understanding that, no, it's about principle, and it's about constantly demonstrating within actions that we are for our liberation. That when you start off with two people, you don't see that as a negative or a failure. You see that as a building towards revolutionary struggle. And then you keep creating with other like-minded people. That is, I encourage people to sit with that, because then you can also point out the red flags of groups who don't move in that way and why, and what they actually serve. I'll continue. They also established a surreptitiously circulated, sorry, I probably butchered that word, a handwritten newspaper called the Inmates Forum, which had an estimated circulation of 200 at its peak. While the relationship between the PLF and the ILF is unclear, what is clear is that on the eye of the jail rebellion, captives increasingly saw themselves as political agents capable of transforming their material conditions and the broader world. Though it began with these furtive processes of sharpening the spear, the Long Attica Revolt announced itself to the world on August 10th, 1970. On that day, Tombs captives on the ILF stronghold of the 9th floor captured 5 hostages and demanded an audience with the authorities. Hours later, Commissioner McGarth entered the jail and participated in what a mayoral tongue-tied aide called a long, loud, and angry face-to-face meeting with Victor Martinez and others, including Hubert X. Blyden, who would later be elected as a spokesperson in Attica. After extracting promises that DOC would not retaliate and that the captives' long-ignored grievances would be published by the elite press, the rebels released their hostages unharmed. A writer for the Black Panther recognized that although their most legible demands were for rights, their tactics signified a much deeper demand. Finally, the accumulated frustration, desperation, and rage of the prisoners was transferred into a flaming determination to better their plight by taking the only form of action that the pigs of the power structure relate to: revolutionary action. The grievances appeared in the New York Times the following morning, as if to punctuate their urgency. That afternoon, captives confined to the psychiatric unit on the 4th floor accosted 3 guards by leaping on them from a catwalk 12 feet above. Rebellion then spread to the 5th, 7th, and 8th floors until more than 800 rebels were in control of most of the facility. I know that's fucking right. Oh man, that should be getting me excited. I love reading this shit. Sorry, y'all, I'm gonna keep going. They swarmed throughout the jail and assaulting the physical expressions of their degradation. They set fire to bedding, destroyed their medical records, smashed windows, and threw handwritten messages, burning trash, and dead rats into the downtown Manhattan streets. After reiterating their demands, they began to release their hostages unharmed. These actions were demonstrations of the captives' capacity to inflict what Huey P. Newton called a political consequence. They were warnings about what was to come if the minimum demands for ameliorating jail conditions were not addressed. Although they no longer held leverage over the lives of hostages, the rebels remained in control of portions of the tombs for 10 more days. During this period of limited self-rule, they continued to sharpen the spear, discussing ways of exercising power despite their physical incapacitation. One idea involved taking their case before the United Nations, where the captives would argue their conditions violated the Geneva Convention relative to the treatment of prisoners of war, the statement on the treatment of criminal offenders, and the provisions related to the crime of genocide. While this plan never came to fruition, its ideation was indicative of an abolitionist internationalism that would reach its fullest expression in Attica, Chapter 3. Experimenting with another form of leverage, the rebels organized a boycott of the courts. I just have to say one thing, because every time I read about the conditions of these networks of concentration camps that exist and expand, and I think of, being in this time of where we see revolt happening across the global South, and we see the white supremacist empire in its throes, overexert itself and expand even more to repress as many of those rebellions as possible. I oftentimes think of how us within the imperial core, yes, we pick up on things like free Palestine, free Sudan and Congo, like we should absolutely need to amplify more. I oftentimes think about how we forget and overlook our people, again, held captive by the state within the prison industrial complex, AKA the network of concentration camps here. And the conditions that they face because of propaganda have conditioned us to view it as necessary or justified or something to be reformed. Instead, we should be in a permanent armed struggle to free our people by any means necessary, because over 2 million people are literally behind enemy lines right now. The ways in which this fucking white supremacist system has conditioned us to view our own dehumanization as something to adjust to and normalize, I will never forgive these crackers until my dying breath. I swear to God. Experimenting with another form, I'm sorry, I'll get back to the book. Experimenting with another form of leverage, the rebels organized a boycott of the courts. As Melvin Alston, a surviving jail rebel, told me, our strategy was to completely withdraw our participation. We felt that if none of us went to court, we could back the system up even more than it already was and force them to concede to our demands. That shit is so dope and so fucking brave. Like, think about that shit, man. Not all of them are there for the same crime. So you have some people who, if they go to court, they might get out that day or within the 2 weeks, who have to stand in solidarity and say, nah, there's a bigger struggle here. And that happened. There's something I want y'all to research called the Pennington Two in Louisiana, and how those two brothers, again, living in these fucking horrible, disgusting, repressive conditions, even though they could have got out a lot sooner, stood in solidarity with that rebellion, and now will never get out. But again, that's the kind of sacrifice it's going to take. And if we reflect that on ourselves, those who are on the outside, we see why it's so difficult, or we see how people become collaborators because they have a stake within the system remaining not the same, because it always gets worse, but to try to sit there and hopefully bribe their way into a position where they think they're safe at the expense of us, the oppressed. And how, again, having that bar raised in our political consciousness to say, it's not enough to just be anti our conditions. We have to be for liberation through action and struggle. And again, it requires those who are most privileged to just be willing to sacrifice in terms of class suicide. And that's what solidarity looks like. Fuck a pen or a fucking pussy hat. The more received coverage in the elite press, with the New York Times reporting that on August 17th, only 94 out of the 190 detainees scheduled for hearings appeared in court. The action also spread across the East River to Branch, Queens, which had an even lower court turnout, with only 13 out of 11 people on the schedule appearing before a judge. I know that's fucking right. An enthusiastic participant in the boycott, Melvin recalls how he was tricked into appearing in court. He was told his parents had come to see him, but when he arrived at what he thought was a visiting area, he was greeted by a judge who summarily sentenced him to 10 years in prison. From there, he was loaded into a bus and shipped upstate. And again, so important that we cover this and reading this aloud is that the different ways in which the state reacts to people grabbing their own self-determination and resisting oppression, and how we have to be very cognizant of that. So we can't, when we see red flags, right, we can't be resistant to accountability, and we can't be resistant to being critiqued. And that's really important, because we need to start seeing that as a measure of security as well. When someone refuses to be held for criticisms or held accountable, that's a liability. That's someone who is a liability to the movement. You got to X them out. And that's important to realize. Now, I'm not saying this person was a liability. I'm talking about the ways in which they try to trick us, and how, again, we have to hold each other accountable, and also see the ways in which inter-community violence should be looked at as counter-revolutionary. Because look at how These people are resisting their inhumane conditions. And you have people like the CEOs who tricked him. You have the judge who's there to also do his part and showing his class solidarity to his people who are repressing these people by taking part in the charade. I mean, it's so sick the lengths in which people will go to, but we have to understand and we have to study and we have to be prepared that, they won't stop. We have to burn this bitch down, motherfuckers. I'm trying to tell y'all, but let me continue, man. Commissioners McGarth then authorized a mass transfer in which 2/3 of the tomb's populations, including Martinez, were transferred into Branch Queens. He later cited the fact that captives were no longer forced to sleep in the hallways and on floor as evidence that his administration was following through on its promises to improve conditions. However, a captive named Curtis Brown saw things differently. For Brown, who would play a key role in the rebellion's next phase, DOC didn't solve the problems. What they did was transfer the problem from the tombs to Queens. Okay, and that's what concessions do. So we can't be lured by like Joe Biden said, hey, I'm gonna legalize weed. Man, fuck you. It's just burn this shit down by any means necessary. That is not a sign that things are getting better or that he's willing to listen, or that the white supremacist empire has now grown a conscience. It cannot. So we have to stop looking for those things to happen or see those things as a sign that things are getting better, so we need to relax. We should be turned up and keep that fire ablaze. Turnabout Day. The revolt developed, and again, why we should be tapped into our people held hostage in the network of concentration camps called the prison industrial complex, because they're already on this type of time. Again, these are people, political prisoners who've been locked up 50 plus years, organizing every day. And like I said, when I talk to my people, my comrades locked up, they're doing their part. Even though they get transferred a lot, every time they move, they start a new cadre. And we need to get tapped in because they've kept the revolution ongoing if we want to keep it 100. The revolt developed in dialectical relations to state tactics of domestic war against radical social movements. In 1969, the same year, the J. Edgar Hoover infamously deemed the BPP the greatest threat to internal security of the country. Armed agents of the state intensified their efforts to neutralize, quote unquote, radical left movements, especially the BPP. One study circulated that by year's end, One study circulated by year's end, 749 Panthers were arrested and jailed, 24 were killed by police, and scores more were injured. As planned, this strategy deprived the party of some of its most dedicated members. However, the incarcerated targets of COINTELPRO repression continued to organize behind the walls, fueling anti-carceral rebellions. Responding to this development, the day after DOC reasserted control in the tombs, Hoover urged the Bureau to pay closer attention to carceral institutions. Recruiting activities of Black extremist groups, establishment of such groups within penal institutions, plans made for violent action by these groups, and overall racial picture within penal institutions are of definite interest to Bureau and many other agencies. The state employed the preventative detention strategy that it used in a generalized way against populations deemed, quote unquote, surplus in a targeted fashion against Black revolutionaries. On April 2nd, 1969, the NYPD executed coordinated pre-drawn raids, capturing several members of New York's BPP. Each of the Panther 21, as they came to be known, were held on a $100,000 bail and indicted on a range of fabricated charges, including conspiracy to assassinate police officers and bomb police stations, the subway system, the department stores, and other public places. A prosecutor later explained that the indictment was intentionally worded to paint the Panthers as terrorists, decimate the prejudicial information to potential jurors, and legitimize warlike responses by the state. That is really important because we have to understand the power of being able to label a people a dehumanizing term in order to justify the dehumanizing treatment done on behalf of the state, and how us as oppressed people cannot adopt those terminologies and those languages. So when people tell us to stop using fucking slurs, it's not a debate. That is a security measure taken and also a revolutionary act to understand that we are not going to co-sign the state dehumanizing any group because we understand that that comes at the expense of us all. I have to put that in there because, again, when we sit there and we allow people to be labeled criminal, to be allowed to be labeled thugs, to be allowed disposable, degenerate, all of those terms that I see circulating and that I see gaining more and more popularity, a lot of eugenicist terms as well. What we're doing is, again, conditioning ourselves to normalize our own repression. And so that we can be put into mental institutions and that can be justified and locked away so that when they go after revolutionaries and people who are resisting this oppression, their warlike tactics against the oppressed people can be justified because we have adopted their language. So when you get corrected and someone tells you that something is a slur or something is dehumanizing, if you are for the liberation of you and your people, your job is to correct. A prosecutor later explained that the indictment was intentionally worded to paint the Panthers as terrorists, disseminate prejudicial information to potential jurors, and legitimize warlike responses by the state. Reflecting on the absurdity of this ordeal, BPP and BLA member Assata Shakur would later write, "It was well known by everybody in the movement that the New York police had kidnapped the most experienced, able, and intelligent leaders of the New York branch and demanded 100,000 ransom for each one." 4 months later, in a lesser-known case dubbed the Mini Panther trial by the press, 4 more New York Panthers were captured, charged with conspiracy and held on $50,000 bail, this time for a planned exploration of the New Dustin Hotel, a known Harlem drug market. Kawazi Balagoon, one of the Panther 21, later called the commencement of the Branch Queens Rebellion Turnabout Day. This statement was fitting, not only because the rebellion reversed the relations of power within the institution, relations between the keepers and the kept, but also because the Branch Queens rebels were responding to the broader strategy of state repression that had reduced their incarceration. It began at noon on October 1st, 1970, when captives on the 4th floor forced their way through a gate, rammed a guard against the concrete wall, and demanded his keys. After incarcerating him and others on what Balagoon called the right side of the wars for a change, they uncaged the entire population, including 9 members of the Panther 21, who DOC had been holding in political quarantine in an isolated wing of the jail. Upon seizing power, the rebels began to discipline their movement into a durable form of organization. They held elections, selecting as their leaders 3 members of the Panther 21, Balagoon, Lumumba Shakur, and Kwando Kinshasa. I always say his name wrong, I'm so sorry. Kinshasa, along with Victor Martinez and 2 politically unaffiliated captives, one black and the other white. I want to stop there and pause on that because oftentimes you'll hear people say, we can't have resistance movement and direct action and revolution until we first organize. And as if you study history and if you study not only prison rebellions, but also the revolts going on across the global South throughout time, that's not the case. That's not the case. And oftentimes, sometimes we harp on that and we see the result what ends up happening is that not only do we provide cover for the state to allow to continue to go unchecked and uncontested, we help normalize that shit too. So I encourage all of us to grapple with our conditioning of resisting violent forms of resistance and why we're so comfortable and why the state is so comfortable emphasizing and shoving down our throat nonviolence. You would come to the logical conclusion, I would hope, that nonviolence helps the state. So then it would help you, it would have us question rather than what is struggle and what does that look like. Upon seizing power, the rebels began to discipline their movement into a durable form of organization. Oh, I'm sorry about that. There we go. With their leadership committee intact, they fortified their positions, barricaded entry points, established guard posts, assigned rotating sentries, and developed a system for carrying messages to different areas of the jail. Announcing an incipient challenge to U.S. territorial sovereignty, they hung a red, black, and green flag out of the top floor window. It represented Pan-African unity and a declaration of what anti-colonial revolutionaries in Mozambique called semi-liberated zones, spaces from which colonial forces had been expelled and where insurgent self-governance could be actively nourished. Don't that sound good? The branch queen's demand reflected the captives' desire to engage with broader political struggles. In addition to affirming the published tomb's demands, the rebels demanded an end to censorship and asserted their right to read the Black Panther and Palante, I don't know how to say that out loud, sorry, the YLP's official organ. They also called for more Black people to be assigned to the Panther 21 jury and for the release of Panther 21 member Afeni Shakur, whose bail from the Women's House of Detention had recently been revoked. Rehearsing a strategy that could, and yes, that's Tupac's mom, rehearsing a strategy that would later be used in Attica, they called for the presence of neutral observers to oversee any future negotiations and pressure DOC to keep its promises. Finally, in an effort, sorry, I had to turn the page. In an effort to communicate with the public on their own terms, they called for a press conference. These demands reflected a key tension within the Long Attica Revolt, the coexistence of El Morel, I don't know how to say that word, sorry, y'all, and revolutionary yearnings. These often contradictory ambitions were evident in Martinez's remarks, his appeal to liberal democratic values at one moment and his transgression of those values at another. He stressed the demand for basic rights of dignity, respect, and justice, then invoked an irrational and utopian aspiration. This is not a protest. This is not a riot. This is a whole thing, he explained. We are going to create a paradise out of this hell. The rebellion was at once a struggle for recognition within the existing social order and a struggle to upend that order. Drawing a distinction between this rebellion and the one back in August, where hostages were released soon after they were captured, Martinez let it be known that he and his comrades were prepared to make the ultimate sacrifice. We are ready to die and kill until you pigs give us back our rights. I know that's fucking right. The press conference marked a turning point in the rebellion. As it was taking place, captives in the tomb seized hostages for the third time in as many months. Curtis Brown later explained that upon catching live news coverage of the Branch Queen's rebellion, captives in the tombs decided to expand the struggle to a second site. As they were in transit on the 11th floor, a small group sprang out of line, split into two formations, and seized physical control of the guards. Ricardo de Leon explained to the Village Voice, the actual takeover was executed perfectly, like clockwork. It was a complete surprise, a classic guerrilla operation. De Leon was a Vietnam veteran and a defendant in the Mini Panther trial. He and Brown were elected to a revolutionary committee, and following the lead of their counterparts in Manhattan, they captured hostages, erected defensive fortifications, and affirmed the minimal demands. Later that night, captives in another jail, the Queen's House of Detention at Kew Gardens, opened a third front of struggle. At 9 p.m., a torrent of enraged humanity sabotaged state property, set several fires, and tore through the tiers. Though they took no hostages, roughly 900 rebels seized 6 of the jail's 8 floors. The New York Times described the situation as one of the most serious crises in the history of the city prisons. More than 1,400 inmates in 3 jails were in command of scores of cell blocks and were holding a total of 23 hostages, including 3 guard captains, 14 guards, and 6 civilian employees. And the crisis continued to deepen. On October 3rd, nearly 1,500 rebels in the Brooklyn House of Detention seized 3 more hostages and gained control of 7 out of the institution's 9 floors. The American Correctional Association's warning about the dangers of quote-unquote contagious rebellions had come to fruition. I know that's fucking right. Although they had declared themselves quote-unquote one people, this multi-sized rebellion was riddled with internal contradictions. De Leon explained that while the Revolutionary Committee was hassling with the administration, developing lines of communication with the outside through various reporters and interested parties who came to the roofs of the buildings facing the jail, disruptive elements emerged from within. All the divisive influences began to make themselves manifest. Quarrels and fights were developing in the ranks about the dumbest things: food, cigarettes, candy, and pills. Some of the committee members were on ego trips. The pillheads were running around creating confusion and fighting. Ethnic animosity between the Blacks and Puerto Ricans was smoldering, fanned by ignorance and fear of the oppressor. Between dealing with pigs and trying to maintain a united front, all our efforts were being dissipated on ineffectual inactivity. Don't that fucking sound familiar? I'm gonna keep reading. Let's see. So it's 1 o'clock now, so I've been reading for an hour. I'm gonna try to finish this chapter. So this space might be 2 hours just in case. So, and of course it's recorded and it's so that people can listen to it like an audiobook. So feel free to return to it. And the PDF is in this linked in the space, as well as my comrade, Kassim Jiro, a new African, locked up for 20 years, organizing behind bars as we speak. His information is also there and a link to put money on his books for survival funds. So if you can support, and please share it. I'll get back to the reading. Oh, there's also a crowdfund post in the replies, and I encourage y'all to support that as well. Curtis Brown agreed that drugs were a major barrier to organization. He was a recovering addict who had kicked his habit by handcuffing himself to a radiator, subsequently making it his mission to help others free themselves of addiction by teaching them how to replace drugs with politics. He told a producer at WBAI FM that he didn't sleep. Sorry, let me get water. That he didn't sleep at all while he was up there. That during the rebellion, most of his time was spent confiscating drugs from the population. Notably, this anti-drug policy ran contrary to the jail's normal operation. According to an investigation of the tombs, pills were dispensed like popcorn at a mad movie. There was also an important contradiction between the pre-trial majority and the roughly 3,000 captives who have been convicted of crimes and were serving short sentences. Many from the latter category were employed in jobs to perform the reproductive labor of, and reproductive is in quotes, of the jail. That is, they cooked the food and did building maintenance and custodial services. Unlike the detainees who were held in limbo, the time men, in quotes, as they were called, had set release dates to look forward to and often lived in their own section of the jail where conditions were substantially better than for the general population. Following the takeovers, the time men of QHD smuggled out a letter pleading with prison cracks to allow them safe passage out of the jail, or at least to send in sandwiches to keep them from going hungry. They assured the authorities, "We stand in a neutral position as not one time man has participated in any act of aggression against the institution." And I read that kind of wonky. So basically what the one-time men is what the people who have short prison terms are saying is that they didn't take part in this, so they're neutral. So it's interesting, again, to read this, and as well as the letters I'm going to start sharing with y'all on the app, is that they describe they have a class analysis of their conditions within prison, and we need to learn and understand that because it can help us better understand ours as well out here, and how people within those certain classes act and react to revolt, and how it's very important that we build a strategy understanding that, because not all skin folk is kinfolk. Not all people within your class is going to be within favor of being liberated. There's going to be collaborators. There are going to be some who are there in the beginning and that later turn coat. There's going to be some people who, even though they have the most to lose, will still collaborate with the state. So all these things, again, have been written about and analyzed and are currently being done so with our brothers and sisters held captive by the state and some of us out here. But I encourage us to do a better effort of learning about what's happening within the network of concentration camps known as the prison, because I believe we've overlooked their part in this ongoing struggle for liberation. And we do so at our own detriment. Following the takeover, the 10 men of QH, I'm sorry, I already read that part. Balagoon wrote of an incident over bean pies that were delivered to the Branch Queens rebels by the Nation of Islam. The popular desserts arrived at night while most were asleep. The thought was that it would be best to pass them out to those who were awake, since 90% of those awake had been carrying the burden of the most responsibilities, he explained. There were enough to go around, but a few people devoured the remaining pies such that a sizable amount of the inmates did not receive any. In a context where food is characteristically deployed as a technology of control, a weapon of war, thus culturally significant desserts represented a meaningful source of substance and pleasure in an otherwise drab environment. In his autobiography, Balagoon, who would soon declare himself an anarchist, did not elaborate on the impact this affront had on the morale of the rebels, and if or how those who took more than their fair share were held accountable. However, the fact that he discusses this challenge at all emphasis and interest in the mechanics of self-governance and the equitable distribution of resources. Okay. If the rebellion was going to succeed and evolve into a full-blown revolution, as Balagoon, Martinez, and others hoped it would, the rebels would have to develop autonomous systems capable of meeting their needs. In this way, the seemingly trivial bean pie incident signified deeper challenges for how the rebels would organize the world they sought to build from the ground up. These fissures and tensions clarify the significance of Caspar Baker Gary's manual, his attempt to forge discipline and unity through organization, education, and oath-taking reflected an understanding that in the face of opposition, solidarity had to be nurtured, defended, and indeed enforced. Any prisoner who actively opposes the revolution should be eliminated as soon as possible. Otherwise, they will corrupt all meaningful progress, his manual states. As will soon become clear, the inability of the rebels to develop the level of unity Caspar called for contributed to the rebellion's collapse. This next section is called A Legal Jailbreak. It was in this context that Branch Queens became the site of a bail review hearing, unlike any that had occurred previously or since. During the press conference, the rebels announced their plan to expose the violence of the bail system. They released 2 hostages as a show of good faith and promised to release 2 more if New York State Supreme Court judges were brought to the jail to review their cases. If this did not happen, however, the rebels announced their readiness to carry out executions. The authorities conceded, a decision that took them into uncharted legal territory. As one official noted, we were being asked to set a legal precedent that was logistically impossible and probably illegal. Figuring things out on the fly, a coterie of judges, mayoral aides, and attorneys convened in the Manhattan office of Frank Hogan, prosecutor in the Panther 21 case. Now, I started getting tongue-tied because I wanted to speak about, you see how them pigs react when you put the fucking gun at their fucking temple? Them motherfuckers make mountains move, you hear me? They was like, yo, the logistics and the way my bank account is set up, I don't know. And they're like, oh, y'all about to kill people? Okay, look, this is what we can do. We can meet you in the jail. And you know what I'm saying? So when we see people harp on this need to justify their resistance by saying we're nonviolent or we're doing it the right way, we see where that leads to nothing. And that you actually should be cheering for the people who says, why the fuck would I go by the rules set by the oppressor when they're there to repress me? I'm going to break every rule. So you should cheer on the unruly. You should cheer on the rule breakers. Like, you should cheer on dissent. But again, we'll go over like how you go about that in a principled way, in a way that addresses contradictions head on, in a way that understands that we do all this not for the fuck of it, but because we want to liberate a society for all people. They're there examined there, which is they're talking about the jail. There they examined the case files and court records of 47 bail candidates who have been selected by the rebels. As per a previous agreement, None of the Panther cases would be reviewed, nor would any involving homicide, armed robbery, or kidnapping. And so it was that for several hours on October 3rd, 1970, a three-panel held court on the grounds of a jail controlled by criminals, radicals, and revolutionaries. Lawyers, police, media, and the elected spokesmen of the rebellion packed the small anteroom. I don't know how to say that. One by one, the judges seated at the end of a long conference table called the names on their list. Fresh out of law school, Gerald Lecroft, or Lefcourt, a young white attorney for the Panther 21, had no doubt that his clients would have killed the remaining hostages had the hearings not taken place. They were all so serious, he recalled, and the Panthers were facing life and assumed that they would do life. Gilberto Jimenez was the first name called. Like all who came after him, he stepped forward and named Lefcourt as his legal counsel. Jimenez had been awaiting trial on a charge of possessing stolen property. The judges reviewed his case while, I'm sorry, let me get some water. The judges reviewed his case. So can y'all hear me? Hopefully it's still recording. So Gilbert Jimenez was the first named called. Like all who came after him, he stepped forward and named Lefcourt as his legal counsel. Jimenez had been awaiting trial on a charge of possessing stolen property. The judges reviewed his case file and criminal record, conferred briefly with each other, and summarily reduced his bail from 500 to 0. Although he was still facing charges, he was now free to leave on his own recognizance. Y'all hear this shit? So they took over those motherfucking prisons, right? And said, hey, no, y'all gonna hear this case, and y'all gonna hear it here in the prison that we run. And they got 3 Supreme Court. All power to the fucking people. You hear what I'm saying? Like, man, you put pressure on these fucking crackers, and that's how you get results. The sound of the gavel, I'll get back to reading. The sound of the gavel rapping against the table signified the finality of the decision. Jimenez was then escorted out of the gates of Branch Queens, but not before embracing each other at the organizers in a show of gratitude. He immediately joined the Young Lords Party and continued to support the revolt as part of the ILF. I know that's fucking right. The judges reached the same conclusion in 8 other cases. Yo, sorry, I be getting hyped reading this shit, bruh. Imagine that shit, yo. They organized, educated, created networks and systems, and took over the prisons and got to see your comrade walk out free. Damn. An additional 4 men had their bails reduced to $25 each and were also able to walk out the front gates after the supporters, amassed outside, pulled the 100 necessary to post the bails. All told, 13 men, many of whom had languished in jail for more than a year, were set free in a matter of hours. This was an astonishing confirmation not only of the captives' long-standing indictment against the state for compromising or for conspiring to keep them locked up, but also for the legitimacy of the rebellion and their use of political violence. A local politician was convinced that had the judges stayed to hear all 460 cases, at least 400 of those men would have been freed on the spot. This did not happen. Instead, after presiding over these initial cases, the judges disregarded the other 35 names on the list, terminating the hearings. While he was pleased to see Jimenez and the others leave, Balagoon saw the reduction as a token gesture. They didn't dig submitting to anything close to justice, but just did as much as they had to do, he wrote later. As we sat in his Manhattan office and discussed these events nearly 15 years after they occurred, Lefcourt said the experience was one of the most unusual things I've ever lived through or heard about. It was the first ever, quote unquote, legal jailbreak. His apt pairing of the antonyms legal and jailbreak exposes how the rebels' mobilization of collective disorder and lawbreaking produced a favorable outcome that was sanctioned by law. In that small anteroom, the objects of law destabilized the state's monopoly over the legitimate use of violence and exerted power over and through the agents of law. Under the threat of violence from below, the legal system surmounted its massive backlog and circumvented the procedural inefficiencies that were supposedly the cause of the ballooning detention population. So basically, he's pointing out all the contradictions that we get fed to justify why they hold these people on bail. And by, again, violent political action and making them perform there on the spot within a zone controlled by the rebels themselves. The display showed us, the people who study this, who pay attention, that, no concession is a sign of progress or liberation. That these people do not have to do the things that they do, and none of this is justified. That we are actually justified in all violent action to get liberated by any means necessary. And there doesn't have to be an event, or there doesn't have to be permission that we ask for or we get a permit for. That if we decide that now is the time, we're actually fucking late because the whole global South is in revolt. And so again, by studying the work and the rebellions that our people have been an ongoing struggle with behind enemy lines, AKA in the prisons, again, we understand the full picture of what we have to undergo and what we have to get popping. The event had a profound impact on left court's political development and that of a whole generation of radical lawyers who increasingly came to understand themselves as the legal support arm of a revolutionary movement unfolding on the streets and within the jails of the United States. Imprisoned revolutionaries approached the hearing as a means of delegitimizing the state, giving the rebels incapacity to win as Gramscian war of maneuver against a militarily and technologically superior enemy. They organized the hearing as an act of political theater, dramatizing the legal system's dereliction of its duty to provide equal protection under the law for a sizable fraction of its subjects. As a result of their militant action, human beings were released from the teeth of the state, exposing the violence of the judicial discretion and affirming the rebels' claims that they were being subjected to a genocidal conspiracy. Yet, there was a contradiction here too. By forcing the judiciary to adhere to its own standards, that the criminally charged should be presumed innocent, be granted due process of law, and receive speedy trials, their legal jailbreak could be viewed as an acquiescence to state authority. As legal theorist Isaac D. Balbus explains, those who would argue that delegitimation can result from the failure of law to live up to its promises fail to understand that the legitimation of the legal order is not primarily a function of its ability to live up to its claims or redeem its pledges, end quote, but rather of the fact that its claims or pledges are valued in the first place. Okay. So basically, the political theater they, forced the institution to perform is not because they believe in the law and that is justice, or if they were to see to all their demands that somehow absolved them of what the state is. No, they're saying that we're showing that these contradictions show that we should not value their law, that they are not the proponents of morality. They're in no position to be judge, jury, or execution, and that there is no such thing as crime under their rule, because they are in fact criminal and holding us hostage and committing genocide against us. And that the participation of the CEOs, the judges, the lawyers, and all branches of this institution are all in conspiracy against us in our genocide. And they gotta go. For this perspective, one might be tempted to view the hearing as an appeal for the system reform itself in accordance with this stated principles. While many within and beyond the rebellion saw the movement in this way, it is critical to understand that this struggle unfolded amid a robust revolutionary culture. 2 years earlier, Queen Mother Moore and other citizens of the newly formed Provisional Government of the Republic of New Africa, a Black revolutionary formation that sought to secede from the United States, signed a Declaration of Independence. In the spring of the following year, BPP chapters began organizing people's tribunals, makeshift court proceedings in which community members adjudicated conflicts and determined the guilt or innocence of the accused and handed down penalties on their own authority. The party, Oregon, described these tribunals as the only legitimate and just recourse that Black people have to redress their grievances. At the same time, the party was in the early stages of organizing a revolutionary People's Constitutional Convention, where they planned to convene representatives from various radical left organizations on the campus of Howard University in Washington, D.C., in order to author and ratify a new constitution that reimagined the United States as a democratic and anti-imperialist formation. The bail review hearing must be understood within this broader revolutionary imaginary in which efforts to hold the state accountable to its own law coexisted with attempts to delegitimize established law and efforts to establish new law. Concerning violence. Violence lay at the core of this conflict, and both sides of the important considerations concerning its use. When captives, an already criminalized and dishonored population, attacked jail infrastructure, seized hostages, and threatened them with execution, they defied the moral and legal norms that granted the state a monopoly on legitimate violence. Their revolutionary action gave rise to an alternate political, ethical, and moral universe where established terms like quote-unquote murder and quote-unquote killing failed to convey the meaning of taking lives that many believed deserved to be taken. As one of the rebels explained to a radio journalist, "What do you call killing a man who really deserves to die? Because they deserve to die. They should be killed? They are more guilty than we are, if anybody is. They have done 10 times worse than we have ever done. They could ever do. They are the real criminals for allowing this system to perpetuate." As the enforcers of this carceral war, guards were seen as the facilitators of a genocidal process. It is therefore nothing short of remarkable that at least some of them were not immediately executed, either as a tactical move to maximize negotiating leverage or simply as accountability for past violence. As we will see across the ensuing chapters, participants in the Long Attica Revolt exercised immense restraint. Social theorist Cedric Robinson identified the absence of mass violence as a characteristic feature that is always indicated in the histories of the Black radical tradition. Analyzing slave revolts in the United States and the Caribbean, Robinson claims that Blacks have seldom employed the level of violence that they, Westerners, understood the situation required. He sees this generalized refusal among African descendants populations to fully reciprocate violence as they struggle against enslavement, colonialism, and captivity as evidence of their embeddedness within alternate formations of consciousness, a way of being that was not a simple reaction to oppressive conditions. Rather, it was a quote-unquote revolutionary consciousness that proceeded from the whole historical experience of Black people and not merely from the social formations of capitalist slavery or the relations of production colonialism. Robinson's argument is provocative, and the content of this book seems to support his theory. However, as I will show, the question of violence was just that, a question, and it was fiercely contested. Historical analysis of Attica in general and the prison movement more broadly have tended to produce fetishized portrayals of Black victimization while obscuring these internal debates and the forms of violence the rebels considered planned and often enacted. Moreover, the decision to exercise restraint was viewed by many, especially those later associated with the Black Liberation Army, not as reflection of revolutionary historical consciousness, but as a deep-seated pathology that facilitates Black people's continued subjugation amid a carceral and colonial war. State actors were also grappling with the question of violence, specifically as it related to the public relations crisis the rebellion created. Since August, the rebellion had obtained sympathetic coverage in elite media. The New York Times and other major outlets have published their demands and run stories about the abysmal state of the jails and courts. The public understood that most of the rebels had not been convicted of the crimes for which they were imprisoned and were therefore formally presumed innocent. Moreover, the rebellion had begun to generate massive protests and other solidarity actions from outside organizations. Within this context, state actors feared that a public display of official violence might alienate Mayor John Lindsay's liberal base, further radicalize the rebels, and enlarge their support network. This explains why they had taken a largely conciliatory approach during the first stages of the revolt. I love the way in which the author words this, and I hope it paints a picture in your mind of we are in active warfare. Because if we did embrace that reality, the way in which we allow the police to occupy our homes and our neighborhoods and our schools, we would see that as an insurgency. We would know that, oh shit, this is the enemy. What the fuck? And these are slave catchers there to put us into these, what they call the network of concentration camps, aka the prisons. And we would also see the COs as dangerous as well. Instead of sitting here talking about, oh, that's a good job. They too need to be taken the fuck out, so that our people who are locked up in these concentration camps can also get free. Like, we would approach things so differently, and we would look at the world as a much different place, especially in the way in which we allow the further presence of these fucking pigs in our school systems, elementary school, middle school. These are kids. And fucking what you can easily equate to mini prisons, because why the fuck are we allowing these pigs, these slave catchers, around our children, taking our children? Following a string of victories for the rebels that included the geographic expansion of the rebellion, the press conference, and the bail hearings, authorities resolved to retake the jails by force. Dozens of officers from the Tactical Patrol Force, a specially trained crowd control unit of the NYPD, were brought in to perform additional violence work. From the outset, hostage deaths were seen as an acceptable form of collateral damage, meaning they were going to kill the hostages too. It was about quelling resistance. It's about neutralizing rebellion. They knew how major it is when people, again, in these concentration camps stand up and begin rebelling. And another thing, man, what pisses me off is that we will also have, not that we have like a million and one reasons to boycott all of these fucking corporations and fast food corporations, but honing on the fast food corporations, they give discounts to these fucking slave catchers. The fuck? There should be no one going to no kind of Whataburger, McDonald's, Denny's. I don't give a fuck who it is. Like, they give us in these apartment complexes that will charge us an arm and a fucking leg in order to have shelter, but give these fucking slave catchers discounts and then charge us an extra fee on top of that for the presence of a slave catcher hiding it as security. Man, the way they got us normalized to living in a police state, and we're sitting here waiting for a Project 2025, y'all better wait the fuck up. You don't have to wait for shit. We're already in fascism, like George Jackson said. Back to the reading. Let's see what time it is. Okay, I have another 30 minutes. We're just going to have to consider the hostages expendable, said a high-level DOC official, in a view that echoed the American Correctional Association's position that the value of hostages' lives should be tactically assessed in relation to public perception. Unlike the state response to Attica 11 months later, an assault force did not breach the jails with live ammunition. Police and prison guards were instead outfitted with body armor, riot shields, batons, clubs, bats, axe handles, gas masks, and tear gas. However, the commonly held view that the state incursion of Attica represented a moment of exceptional violence misrecognizes the dynamics of domestic warfare under liberal democracy. The Attica massacre was not a departure from the norm, but its revelation in an intensified form. As political prisoner Martin I don't know how to say that name, Sostre wrote, Attica defrocked the vicious outlaw murderers who were passing themselves off as law authorities. As I will argue later, the massacre was an experiment in the public exhibition of state violence. an attempt to radically recalibrate public understandings of how Black rebellion in the United States could and should be managed. The reassertion of state control over the jails mobilized similar discourses, tactics, and technologies of subjugation, but did so in ways designed to seem like measured liberal governance. At this point in the struggle, the state's strategy was to conceal the fact that a war was unfolding, whereas later it would shift towards dramatizing the state's war-waging superiority. And that's really interesting. So basically, they said that the amount of violence that they used in massacring the resistance fighters in Attica was basically like a temperature check to see how the public would respond to that very public lynching. And that's interesting when we think about it, because we oftentimes you'll hear this talking point of, oh, our police are being trained in Israel by the IDF. And I'm like, the tactics, the repressive tactics we see used among our people today and have been, and something they practice in for suppressing prison rebellions since forever. So no, they're not learning nothing new. And again, it serves as a blind spot that we have for people who are behind enemy lines today, especially in our analysis. Prison Craft surmised that since the BHD and QHD were the most recent jails to erupt, they would be the least organized and ill-prepared to fend off attack. In fact, as they developed their plan to retake the jails, guards had already forcefully suppressed I'm stuttering on that word. I can't say, I'm gonna skip it. Rebellion in the adolescent remand shelter on Rikers Island, in which captives briefly took hostages. So it was that during the late afternoon hours of October 4th, 1970, armed agents of the state flooded the Brooklyn jail with tear gas and forced their way into the fifth floor, swiftly wresting the prison from the rebels and freeing the hostages unarmed. They then traveled to Q's Garden, where the rebels had been in control for 30 hours. They fired tear gas into the fourth floor and used blowtorches to cut through the door hinges and locks. The press later reported that the assault force met heavy resistance from rebels armed with steel pipes, forcing them to respond in kind. However, in a civil rights lawsuit subsequently filed on the captives' behalf, the rebels maintained that they were incapacitated by the gas and tried to surrender. They further claimed that upon reaching the fourth floor, a supervising officer announced, "Kill them all," at which point the assault force commenced ferociously beating them into submission. Although more battles lay ahead, state actors had swiftly recaptured 3 jails, decisively shifting the momentum in their favor. Following these victories, they regrouped to reevaluate their strategy in preparation for the Tombs and Branch Queens, the rebellions that posed the greatest potential to meet them with organized resistance. The state adopted an approach that foreshadowed what would become a normalized aspect of carceral strategy after Attica: psychological warfare. The assault force was instructed to encircle the jails, using a siege tactic to publicly demonstrate its superior capacity for violence, while a recorded ultimatum from Mayor Lindsay was played on local radio stations. The recording informed the rebels that they had 1 hour to release their hostages and face no reprisals, or face other courses of action. Not only did this message aim to degrade the rebels' resolve, it was a clever public relations maneuver that enabled the public to hear their mayor offering the rebels an opportunity to surrender peacefully. If the rebels refused and people were seriously injured or killed, the casualties could be easily attributed to rebel intrinsicy, and not the state's disregard for life. The strategy was effective. As Ricardo de Leon recalls, when the rebels heard Lindsay's ultimatum over the radio, pandemonium ensued. While the rebellion had endured more than 2 days, de Leon, Brown, and others on the Revolutionary Committee had not managed to solidify organizational discipline. Rather, just as the state intended, the promise of protection and the threat of violence exacerbated already existing fissures. Immediately, recalled de Leon, all the waverers, the fence sitters, and opponents started shouting, "Let them all go, let them go," setting off an extended argument about strategy. Before a consensus could be reached, a vocal faction steamrolled the surrender and released the hostages. By midnight on October 5th, 1970, the Tombs rebellion was over, and the rebels were again caged. The Branch Queens rebels had followed the developments in the Tombs on the radio, and in anticipation of the same technique being used against them, also debated surrendering or fighting. According to Balagoon, who named himself after a West African deity of iron and war, the debate occurred between two factions, the warriors and non-warriors. The central questions were first, whether the rebels were going to surrender or fight, and second, whether they were actually prepared to execute their prisoners. For Balagoon, the non-warrior faction was as irrational as was immoral. He believed that as colonial subjects, most of whom were raised in poverty, the rebels should have known from experience that Lindsay could not be trusted, and that even if his no reprisal promise had been sincere, he would not be able to enforce it once the steel cages clanged shut and the rebels were back at the mercy of their captors. Of the captors. They would all suffer consequences, he explained. As the warriors saw it, the only question was whether they would do so alone. Basically highlighting how dangerous concessions are and how dangerous reform is. Put you into a low sense of progression or any steps towards liberation when that's not what it is. Because once people get comfortable and think that it's over and the work has been done, you give room for fascists to tighten up their regime and also to adjust to the new prevailing norms and to keep on repressing the people. Balagoon was also, what time is it? Okay. Balagoon was also distressed by those who refused to kill in order to defend their own existence. He interpreted this phenomenon not as a radically different, quote unquote, shared order of things, as does Cedric Robinson, but in the tradition of Queen Mother Moore, as symptomatic of a pathological plantation mentality that had been inculcated in Black people through generations of racial terror. So fucking on point. Because oftentimes they show the pacifist or the nonviolent person or strategy as the more level-headed, the more intelligent approach. Which, if we look at it on its face, what is intelligent about begging your oppressor to free you? That doesn't even make sense. It seems like a waste of time. So again, I love how he brought that about and said, there's a book that me and Kasim, the brother I told you about who's locked up, are reading together. And it's called The Pathology of Pacifism and how it acts as, I forgot the subtitle, but the subtitle refers to like how it acts as a wet blanket to revolutionary struggle in North America. I'm gonna make that PDF available too as well. It's a good book. We might do a space on it. But yeah, it's something we need to study because as we look at the spectacle of protests and how a lot of them, especially when they get co-opted, begin that talking point of we're the nonviolent one and look at what they're doing to the nonviolent ones. We need to understand what that is, and that's not direct action. It's not revolutionary struggle. It's actually, again, a pathology of pacifism that is actually dangerous and counter-revolutionary if we want to be real with it. Black people have been conditioned to die behind any old bullshit for so long, he wrote, that taking those white pigs' lives in response for murders of ourselves seemed to be incomprehensible to them, a crime against God and 3 other white men. True today. You talk about every time we see the pigs take one of our lives, why we don't take 5 of theirs out. A lot of people argue that that's wrong. We can't do that. Be just as bad as them. Like the theorist Frantz Fanon, whose ideas were profoundly influential to this movement, Balagoon suggests that the primary barrier to the liberation of the colonized was within their own minds, a combination of fear of death, respect for state authority, and deference to white power that had been hammered into the population from birth. Liberation would remain an impossibility as long as colonized subjects respected the taboos put in place by their oppressors. Theorizing this pivotal moment at the level of ontology, Balagoon argued that what was at stake was beyond even questions of life and death, and involved the very existence of colonized people as beings in the world. He believed that through rebellion, the captives had asserted a masculine humanity that disrupted the existing order. He was eminently opposed to the thought of not defending that humanity out of awe of the white man or fear of death. Speaking directly to the readers of his autobiography in an I don't know how to say that word. It's like interrogate, but with an O-R-Y at the end. If someone wants to tell me in my inbox, I appreciate you. Manner, he employs the blues as a mode of theorizing Black life. The quote goes, "Do you who is reading this, here and now, know how it is to feel like nothing? Can you dig how it feels to be tired of feeling like nothing, a piece of shit? Can you dig how it feels to be a human being, a man with a will and a purpose and a quest for justice? Can you relate to being a man for 4 days, then stepping back into a cage that houses a hollow shell, a bundle of blues, a being who receives whatever a treacherous society throws at him, who has been forgotten by so many people that he's forgotten his damn self, and on your own accord? For the sake of an unjust peace and a continuation of non-existence." That's the end of that powerful fucking quote. Balagun's existential mediation conceptualizes violence as a process that demarcates the boundary between ungendered nothingness and masculine being in the world. In later chapters, I explore in greater detail how much claims to masculine humanity should not be confused with the desire to achieve parity with the white man. To the contrary, I argue that by reading and listening to the living practices of this masculine anti-carceral insurgency, we can apprehend the emergence of a gendered humanity unshackled from white patriarchal norms. For now, it is important to note that Balagun's personal biography and that of many other rebels illustrates the incommensurability, of their notion of manhood with hegemonic white masculinity. And it's interesting and good that he points out this and relates it to white patriarchy, because a lot of people do not want to talk about that. And and you'll be confronted too when you do bring it up. People will say, people out here don't care about that shit. That's just internet shit, which shows you they're not tapped in. Because all of my peoples that I talk to behind enemy lines all talk about dismantling patriarchy. That's men, women, non-binary, transgender, all kids in the youth in the juvie system, all of them talk about it, who are organizing and educating people for resistance. So no, that's not something that they leave behind, because they also understand that, again, liberation is about liberating us all. For now, it is important to note that Balagun, I already read that, my bad. For now, where did I leave off? Balagun himself, who died of AIDS in prison in 1986, is remembered by his comrades as a gender rebel, and for several years of his life was in a relationship with a transgender woman. In contrast to the non-warriors, members of the warrior faction proclaimed their preparedness to accept the terms of war imposed upon them by the state and to respond to that violence in kind. In an open letter attributed to the entire Panther 21, but which was primarily authored by Balagun, Lumumba Shakur, and Kawando Kinsasa, I butchered this program. I'm so sorry. Months after this ordeal, these key organizers of the Branch Queens Rebellion offer an unvarnished endorsement of political violence as a productive force for revolutionary transformation. Published in the East Village Other, the infamous letter is most often discussed in historical scholarship for its transient critique of the BPP's turn from armed struggle under the leadership of the Oakland-based Central Committee. This critique exacerbated ideological tensions within the BPP, tensions that the FBI exploited and deepened to cause a split within the party. Although the central purpose of the letter was to criticize the party's perceived pivot toward reformism, the analysis it offers is relevant to the jail rebellion. I'll get some water. So I got another 15 minutes. Revolution is armed struggle. Revolution is violence. Revolution is bloodshed. And the duty of a revolutionary is to make revolution. Following the theoretical trail blazed by Fanon, these engineers of rebellion argued that the violence of the colonized was a rational response to a condition of collective abjection, and that contrary to the portrayal as a quote-unquote extremist, they were not initiating force, but counter-force, not advocating violence, but counter-violence against the normalized and entirely predictable violence of the state. They argued that this counter-violence should be strategically employed to the level the field of battle. I'm sorry, I read that wrong. They argued that the counter-violence should be strategically employed to level the field of battle. We must match the enemy at least, blow for blow at least. You see, for us, things are critical. Every day, every hour. How many of our people are suffering? How many die? They believed that the philosophy of nonviolence facilitated genocide, that police, prison guards, and other agents of the state routinely subjected Black people to abuse because they had no reason to fear retaliation. Within this context, they saw revolutionary counter-violence as a violence reduction strategy. Its aim was to make the wages of war think twice before dispensing abuse. While it is easy to dismiss these ideas as immature expressions of far-left adventurism, they demand to be taken seriously if we jettison liberal modes of analysis and understand what was unfolding as an actual war. From this perspective, the Panthers' unequivocal endorsement of counter-violence is legible as a rational political strategy, a diagnosis of actually existing conditions at an acute moment of confrontation. The warrior faction knew that their small band of incarcerated rebels could not militarily defeat any incursion by agents of the state, and that a battle would mean that many of the rebels would be badly injured, some even killed. However, the Panthers theorized incarcerated people as the tip of the spear. Not only would their determined resistance ensure the casualties were recorded on both sides, it would inspire others to take militant action. To rumble then would have pulled the mass of us together in a truly revolutionary fashion. A victory, that is, to turn back the charge of the pigs, would have produced any army out of prisoners of war who would then be drafted by their incarceration. For Balagoon, all Black people in America are prisoners of war, but most are not conscious of this fact. To engage in combat against the carceral state would heighten their consciousness and draw them into the Black Liberation Army. Balagoon's vision did not materialize. The question of violence was put to a vote, resulting in the non-warriors winning by a margin of 1. Members of the warrior faction considered launching an internecine battle for control of the hostages, but decided against implementing the will or impeding the will of the majority. Instead, they watched as the rebels demobilized, voluntarily returning themselves to non-existence. Some men broke down the barricades, others uncaged the hostages, covered their heads with pillows to protect them from harm, brought them down to the street level, and released them. Then, in small groups, most of the rebels walked down the steps of Branch Queens and turned themselves in. However, 39 of the rebels, including the Panthers and Victor Martinez, refused to willingly enter into police custody, where they knew they would be abused. Instead, they barricaded themselves on the top floor of the jail and promised to continue resisting until their lawyers were able to ensure they could surrender safely. Upon cutting their way into the 4th floor of QHD, a guard captain reportedly announced, "The war is over. You have lost. This is now a concentration camp." This openly fascist declaration of genocidal intent contextualizes the Panthers' embrace of political violence as the only sufficient means of defending their existence. A lawsuit filed on behalf of those who survived the QHD rebellion offers a glimpse of what recaptured rebels across the jail system endured. As Balagoon predicted, despite Lindsay's no reprisals promise, they were immediately subjected to a surplus of trauma. Captives were stripped naked and made to stand at attention, only to be sprayed with fire extinguishers, shot at point-blank range with tear gas canisters, and savagely beaten with clubs, chains, axe handles. At the street level, in front of QHD's lower C gate, spectators observed uniformed men dragging their captives out of the jail and collecting their beaten and bloodied bodies into a writhing pile, estimated by various witnesses to number between 25 and 60 people. So basically what happened is they surrendered, and the promises of peace were, of course, rescinded, and they were subject to immediate and swift violence and humiliation. And as they described about piling their abused and bloody bodies on top of each other, the immediate image should come to mind of the pictures of what they did in Abu Ghraib and in Guantanamo Bay, where they showed how they would pile the naked bodies of their abused, tortured victims. And again, as the prisoners described, those are concentration camps. The prison industrial complex is a network of concentration camps. I'll continue. Let's see. I got about 10 minutes. Offering a glimpse into the violent processes of psychological conditioning through which the killing of white authority figures becomes unfathomable. The guards force the recaptured rebels to chant power to the correction officer. The correction officer is our God. And other affirmations, their mastery and deification. So basically, these sick fucking pigs, while torturing them, made them say these sayings. Power to the correction officer, co-opting power to the people. The correction officer is our God, deifying the correction officer as the white savior and their God, that they should obey, as it says in the Bible, right? Slave, obey your master. Sick psychological warfare. These normally illegal inflictions of white supremacist violence were tactically sanctioned by the federal government. While the FBI generated extensive surveillance of the rebellions, especially those involving Panthers, it was curiously disinterested in tracking abuse of the incarcerated. As a tactic of archival power, indeed of archival war, this active silencing attempts to weaponize history to preserve a one-sided narrative as seen through the eyes of the state. That's so powerful, and why it is so important that the people keep a history, not only through written history, but also respect the oral history traditions to pass on this much needed data of what's going on and what's happening to us. Because just as we know, they are not keeping track of the people they are killing, the settlers are killing in Palestine. So that they can put the numbers on it. And so we should automatically, as people, understand that and know that it is much more than what they will ever report. And that is also in judging our own genocide as African people of African descent here in the white settler colony of America, that our numbers have grossly been underestimated in the way in which they kill and repress us and torture us. And so it's very important for us to, again, be the gatekeepers of our history and respect our traditions to do so. That it might not always come with a degree. The guerrilla intellectual and the guerrilla historian and the guerrilla archivist need to be honored and respected. As a tactic of archival power, indeed of archival war, this active silencing attempts to weaponize history to preserve a one-sided narrative as seen through the eyes of the state. Their surveillance conjures an image of bloodthirsty Black extremists while revealing little about the racial terror that supports the established order. Moreover, at the same time that the FBI was going to great lengths to crush the Black liberation movement, it was hospitable to the consolidation of organized white supremacy within the police, the prisons, the military, leading us to the historical present in which white nationalism and homegrown fascism are flourishing in the open. Casualties were immense. At least one captive, a Black man named Thomas, quote unquote, Shorty Hines, was beaten to death, his lifeless body left lying in a cage for over 24 hours. At least 59 QHD captives were hospitalized for serious injuries, including broken bones, lacerations, and skull fractures. In the weeks following the rebellion, 4 captives, all of whom were Black Puerto Rican men, were found hanged in New York City jail cages. While officials' investigations disputed accusations leveled by the young lords that these deaths were political assassinations, state actors conceded that the jail system was ultimately responsible for letting them die, indicting the prison as a normalized site of necropolitics. Whether by outright murder or malign neglect, the carceral system consumes the lives of the most vulnerable, but but does so in ways that register as justice administration. It was not until 12:30 a.m. on October 6th, with the assistance of Gerald Lefcourt, that the 39 Branch Queens holdouts allowed themselves to be lowered to the ground in groups of 3 in a fire department cherry picker, with their fists raised triumphantly. Lumumba Shakur was the last to exit the jail. As he descended, a crowd of over 200 supporters cheered him on. He responded with the symbolic gesture of liberation. He raised his arm, revealed the keys to the jail, and tossed them to the crowd. Balagoon maintained that love and support from outside groups and organizations energized the rebellion and prevented the rebels from martyrdom. However, in their open letter, the Panther 21 criticized these same supporters for not taking advantage of the opportunities the rebellion created. Organizations such as the BPP, the YLP, and the Women's Bail Fund and Youth Against War and Fascism had organized citywide rallies that drew hundreds of people. While employing militant rhetoric, most of these outside supporters studiously abided the law and remained corralled behind police barricades. Talk that shit. And I mean, we should be drawing the parallels to today. Come on, man. But if we would listen to the most marginalized, they have made these critiques currently. And I'm just going to use the app, this Twitter app as an example, is that when I do see those, especially Black mages, point out these contradictions and how the art of spectacle is acting as a wet blanket to resistance, they are immediately attacked, not just by the fascists, by reactionaries, but also people who would call themselves the left, and how dangerous that is. So again, the way in which critique is raised, especially those that are raising the critiques from the margins. We're drawing parallels from what the radicals of the 60s and the 70s said, that these need to be called out. These are contradictions that cannot exist. So I say all that to say, y'all better start listening to these young folks and these Black mages, and so we can stop repeating the same shit. Because I'd be goddamn if I get reincarnated into this shit. Hell fucking no. And I'd be goddamn if another kid is born into this bullshit too. I'm trying to tell you. Anyways, while employing militant rhetoric, most of these outside supporters studiously abided by the law and remained corralled behind police barricades. The jail's rebellion's warriors, quote unquote, saw this as a missed opportunity. I'm about to read a quote from them. When we were in the Long Island City Branch Queens jail rebellion, we felt that the people outside could have supported us in the fullest revolutionary manner in 2 or 3 simultaneous ways. 1, mass demonstrations at each of the prisons involved. 2, while the pigs, quite a large percentage, were surrounding the prisons, and if there had been mass demonstrations while leaving the city vulnerable, in this case for 5 days, for some righteous urban guerrilla military actions. If the chance occurred to liberate the prisoners at any jail that the opportunity presents itself. Thus, you see, the best tactics in revolution is in continuous confrontation and struggle. And that's the end of the quote. So basically, when we see demonstrations and these protests and these acts of spectacle, other people could be using that as a means to, again, engage in direct action, which many people have and will not go highlight it, especially when it's underground. But in your area and in where you're at, we should all be engaging in struggle in ways in continuous struggle, is what they're saying. So in supporting the resistance going on in Palestine, it's not enough to just have a sign and just hold it up or go to marches and take pictures and post it on Twitter. Matter of fact, it's a wasted opportunity to where we have America outstretched across the global south trying to claim resources to keep this fucking failing empire afloat and to expand white hegemony. You have resistance fighters in all pockets in which that exist, right? That means people in the colonial belly of the beast should be engaged in revolutionary struggle. Like, we are missing an opportunity here. And that's the deal. And instead, we'll sit there and we'll throw up a hashtag or we'll shout a free, whether it's a free Palestine or a free Haiti, but then go to work. I mean, I'm not saying we won't go to work in the guerrilla struggle, but what I'm saying is that we are always in right now, especially with our privilege of being in the belly of the beast. If we are to say what is direct action, we already know what it looks like. We already know what the name of it is, and it's continuous confrontation and continuous struggle. And I mean, with all the resistance going on in the global South, and you see America trying to recolonize Haiti as we fucking speak. Time is always now. The Panthers argued that lawful and peaceful mass demonstrations were necessary, but radically insufficient for a revolutionary struggle against a system engaged in genocidal war. Their critique radically disrupts hegemonic understandings of what solidarity between those within and beyond prison walls can and should look like. While the rebels had successfully organized guerrilla counteroffensives and legal jailbreaks from within, they were calling on those outside the walls to engage in militant acts of strategically organized lawbreaking.